almost died giving birth to my son. And while I was lying in the intensive care unit fighting through the worst 24 hours of my life, my mother-in-law sent me a message telling me she was too busy attending a yacht party to help with her newborn grandson. That was the moment everything changed. Not because I wanted revenge, not because I suddenly became cruel, but because, for the first time in 8 years, I stopped lying to myself about the family I had married into. When I opened my eyes in the ICU at Boston General Hospital, I was not thinking about money, status, or the Sterling name. I was trying to understand whether my baby was alive. The emergency C-section had turned catastrophic so quickly that the memories came back in fragments. A nurse calling for help, a doctor saying my blood pressure was dropping, bright surgical lights, someone telling me to stay awake. Then a terrifying stretch of darkness where I remembered nothing at all. Later, one of the nurses told me there had been a moment when the room went completely quiet because everyone was focused on stopping the bleeding. My son had been pulled from me too early, too small, and too silent for those first few seconds that would haunt me for the rest of my life. When I finally woke and heard that he was alive, fragile but stable, I cried so hard the pain tore through my stitches. For a brief moment, nothing else existed. Then my phone vibrated. The message was from Clara Sterling, my husband's mother. I expected concern. I expected a question. I expected one sentence that proved nearly losing a daughter-in-law and grandson had affected her. Instead, she wrote that she and Julian were leaving for a luxury yacht event and would not be available to help during my recovery. If I needed support, I could hire someone. I stared at the screen until the words stopped looking like language. My son had not even been alive for a full day. I was attached to monitors, unable to sit up without help, and still bleeding through hospital pads. Yet Clara Sterling had reduced my survival to an inconvenience. Looking back, that message mattered because it was not unusually cruel. It was unusually honest. For years, the Sterlings had hidden their selfishness behind polished manners, charitable dinners, and speeches about family loyalty. In that ICU room, the mask slipped. My name is Mackenzie Vance, though everyone calls me Mac. I was 29 years old and working as a senior distributed systems engineer after graduating from MIT. My career revolved around finding weak points inside complex systems before they caused catastrophic failures. I built safeguards. I predicted breakdowns. I protected infrastructure from people who abused access. The irony would have been funny if it had not been so humiliating. I had spent my professional life detecting failures, yet I ignored the biggest failure in my personal life for nearly a decade. When I met Julian Sterling 8 years earlier, I believed I was marrying into one of Boston's most respected old money families. They lived in a historic mansion in Beacon Hill, spoke constantly about legacy, and carried themselves with the confidence of people whose last name had opened doors for generations. At 21, I was impressed. At 29, I understood the truth. Much of the lifestyle they projected existed because someone else was quietly paying for it. That someone was me. Whenever Julian launched another business idea that needed temporary support, I stepped in. Whenever Arthur Sterling faced a cash flow problem he wanted kept out of polite conversation, I covered the gap. Whenever Clara wanted to maintain her position in Boston's social circles, the cost somehow found its way back to accounts connected to my income. None of it happened all at once. That was why it worked. Exploitation rarely arrives wearing its real name. It arrives as loyalty, family responsibility, temporary help, a favor, love. Over the years, helping became expected. Expected became normal. Normal became invisible. Lying in that hospital bed, I opened my financial accounts and saw the pattern clearly for the first time. Clara's supplementary American Express Centurion card, Arthur's card, Julian's card, yacht club charges, private dining clubs, designer purchases, travel bills, insurance payments for cars I rarely touched, years of luxury expenses quietly attached to my credit, my income, and my silence. My fingers trembled as I reached for the old stainless steel Yeti tumbler on the side table, the same dented one I had carried since MIT. My nails tapped against it in the rhythm I used when debugging code. Dot, dot, dash, stop, breathe, decide. Then I made the call, first to my attorney, then to the bank. When the representative asked if I was authorizing the freeze on every supplementary Centurion card, my voice sounded weak from surgery, but the answer came out clear. Yes, freeze all three. Effective immediately, no exceptions. Clara's card, Arthur's card, Julian's card, all of them. No warning, no negotiation, no family meeting, just consequences. I expected the decision to feel dramatic. Instead, it felt strangely calm, like closing a door that should have been shut years earlier. The following 2 weeks were consumed by recovery, exhaustion, and learning how to care for a newborn while healing from surgery. Julian appeared only when it suited him. Clara sent opinions instead of help. Arthur remained largely absent. Each day reinforced a truth I had spent years avoiding. The Sterling family valued what I provided far more than who I was. Then, exactly 14 days after I was discharged, something happened that forced me to reevaluate everything. I was standing near the front window of my townhouse with my son sleeping against my shoulder when a vintage Rolls-Royce slowly pulled up outside. The vehicle immediately caught my attention because it represented a world I thought I had escaped. The engine stopped. The rear passenger door opened. The person who stepped out made my heart skip a beat. It was not Julian. It was not Clara. It was not Arthur. It was someone connected to a chapter of the Sterling family's history that nobody had dared mention around me for years. Someone whose return meant the people who thought they owned me had miscalculated badly. But before I tell you who arrived at my doorstep that afternoon, you need to understand how my relationship with the Sterling family truly began. Because this story did not start in a hospital room. It did not start with frozen credit cards. And it did not start with a yacht party. It started 8 years earlier, on the day a 21-year-old MIT student walked through the doors of the Sterling mansion in Beacon Hill, believing she had finally found a family that accepted her, completely unaware that she was stepping into the most expensive lesson of her life. When I think back to everything that happened later, the ICU room, the frozen credit cards, the Rolls-Royce parked outside my townhouse, and the secrets that eventually tore the Sterling family apart, I always return to one specific memory. It wasn't my wedding day. It wasn't the first argument with Clara. It wasn't even the moment I overheard the conversation that changed how I saw my husband forever. It was a simple question Arthur Sterling asked me 6 days after the wedding. "Mackenzie, could you help the family with something temporary?" At the time, it sounded harmless. Looking back, it was the moment the transaction truly began. To understand why I said yes, you need to understand who I was back then. 8 years earlier, I wasn't the exhausted woman recovering from emergency surgery in a Boston ICU. I was a 21-year-old MIT student who genuinely believed hard work could solve almost anything. I believed people were mostly honest. I believed love was stronger than class differences. Most importantly, I believed that if I proved my value often enough, eventually everyone would accept me. That last belief would cost me more than money. It would cost me years of my life. The Sterling family entered my world during a period when everything seemed to be going right. My grades were strong. My internships were opening doors. Recruiters were already reaching out before graduation. Then I met Julian Sterling. He was confident, handsome, and carried himself with the effortless self-assurance of someone who had never had to prove he belonged. Compared to the engineers and researchers I spent most of my time around, Julian felt exciting. He talked about venture capital, startups, disruptive ideas, and ambitious plans for the future. I mistook confidence for competence because I wanted to believe in him. When he introduced me to his family, I was intimidated. The Sterling mansion in Beacon Hill looked exactly like what a young student imagines old Boston wealth should look like. Historic architecture, expensive art, crystal chandeliers, generations of portraits lining the walls. Every detail seemed designed to communicate status. At 21, I didn't recognize how carefully curated the image actually was. I saw success. I did not see the cracks underneath it. The wedding happened less than a year later. From the outside, it looked perfect. Society photographers documented the event. Local publications mentioned the guest list. White flowers filled the historic church near Back Bay. The reception hall glittered with crystal, polished silver, and old family names moving through the room like titles. Clara Sterling wore pale champagne silk and smiled for photographs with the precision of a woman who understood optics better than affection. Arthur spent most of the evening discussing investments, business relationships, and old Boston connections. Julian smiled for every camera and introduced himself to investors as if the wedding were a networking event built around him. My adoptive parents sat near the front, proud and quietly emotional. They had never cared about status. They were simply happy to see me happy. That contrast should have told me more than it did. My parents had spent their lives building character. The Sterlings had spent theirs building appearances, even during the reception. Small humiliations arrived wrapped in manners. Clara introduced my mother as Mackenzie's adoptive mother, 3 separate times, as if the word adoptive needed to be displayed like a disclaimer. Arthur shook my father's hand once, then turned away before my father could finish asking about his work. Several Sterling relatives asked what my parents did for a living, then responded with soft smiles that felt colder than insults. Nobody said anything openly cruel. That would have been too vulgar for the Sterlings. They preferred making people feel small while leaving no sentence you could quote later. I noticed it. I simply chose not to name it. I wanted the day to be beautiful. I wanted Julian to be proud. I wanted the family to accept me. Clara's favorite phrase that night was Julian's brilliant little computer girl. She said it to donors, cousins, and women wearing diamonds heavy enough to fund my first year at MIT. At first, I treated it like affection. Later, I understood the reduction. She never introduced me as a systems engineer, never as an MIT student, never as someone with a career. My accomplishments were softened into something cute and harmless. Arthur did the same in his own way. When a guest asked about my work, he smiled and said, "Mac keeps the machines happy." Then he immediately redirected the conversation toward Julian's latest investment project. The irony was obvious even then. I was building real systems for real companies. Julian was presenting future companies that mostly existed in slides and expensive conversations. Yet inside the Sterling family, I was support, and Julian was the visionary. He had attended an Ivy League university, but dropped out before graduating. Nobody described it as failure. Clara called it impatience with outdated institutions. Arthur called it entrepreneurial instinct. Every unfinished project became proof that Julian was ahead of his time. Every bad decision became bold risk-taking. Every loss became temporary positioning. I admired him then because everyone else admired him first. That is one of the dangers of marrying into a family with a strong enough myth. If enough people repeat a story confidently, you start believing it before you check whether it is true. After the wedding, the comments became part of daily life. Clara admired finance, law, politics, and old money philanthropy. Engineering fascinated her only when it solved one of her problems. She once asked whether I planned to remain behind a computer forever. Another time, she suggested that being married to Julian might eventually help me move into something more polished. I smiled through it because I wanted peace. More importantly, I wanted belonging. Being adopted had left me with a fear I rarely discussed. My parents loved me deeply, but part of me always worried that belonging could disappear if I stopped earning it. The Sterling family sensed that weakness long before I understood it myself. 6 days after the wedding, Arthur invited me into his office. The room was designed to impress people. Dark wood shelves lined the walls. Framed photographs showed him standing beside politicians, investors, and business leaders. A crystal decanter sat on a polished side table. Arthur explained that one of his investment funds was experiencing a short-term liquidity issue. Nothing serious, just temporary. He needed $15,000 to bridge a gap for a few weeks. Then he looked me directly in the eye and delivered the phrase I would hear repeatedly over the next 8 years. "Family helps family." I remember hesitating. $15,000 was not a small amount for me. Most of my savings came from scholarships, internships, consulting work, and years of discipline. Yet Arthur spoke with such calm authority that questioning him felt almost disrespectful. So I transferred the money. He thanked me warmly. The repayment never came. Weeks passed. Then months. Every conversation produced a new explanation, a new delay, a new promise. Eventually, I stopped asking directly. Instead, I opened an encrypted spreadsheet. and recorded everything: date, amount, reason, outstanding balance. At the time, it felt like a simple engineering habit. Systems only function when reality is documented. What I did not realize was that the spreadsheet marked the beginning of a pattern that would continue for years. Arthur asked for money. Julian asked for support. Clara asked for sacrifices. The requests were always framed as temporary. The benefits somehow always flowed in the same direction, toward them. During that period, another habit became part of my daily life. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I tapped my fingers against my old stainless steel Yeti tumbler. Dot, dot, dash. A simple Morse rhythm I developed during long nights at MIT while debugging complex systems. It helped me think. It helped me focus. It helped me remain calm when situations did not make sense. Clara hated the tumbler. She thought it looked cheap sitting beside the crystal glasses scattered throughout the mansion. At one dinner, she quietly replaced it with a cut crystal water glass beside my plate. I thanked her, picked up the Yeti, and said it kept things at the temperature they were supposed to be. Her smile tightened. Looking back, that small moment represented everything separating us. I valued function. They valued performance. I trusted results. They trusted reputation. I believed substance created status. They believed status excused the absence of substance. The moment everything finally clicked happened several months after the wedding. One evening, after a family dinner, I stepped onto a second-floor balcony to take a work call. The Boston air was cold. The city lights stretched beyond the trees. Before I could dial, I heard voices nearby. Julian and Clara. Neither realized I was there. At first, I paid little attention. Then I heard my name. "She's working harder than ever," Julian said. Clara laughed softly. "Good. Someone has to." There was a pause. Then she said the sentence that stayed with me for years. "She's just a messy little coder, but her brain is the only thing keeping this family afloat." "Use it!" I froze. What shocked me was not only the cruelty, it was the casualness. There was no anger in Clara's voice, no guilt, no hesitation. She sounded like someone discussing a financial asset, a tool, a resource, something useful. Julian did not defend me. He did not sound offended on my behalf. He simply lowered his voice and asked, "How much do you think she can build before she realizes it?" Clara answered without missing a beat. "Enough to make sure she cannot walk away." Standing there in the dark with my Yeti tumbler in my hand, I felt something shift inside me for the first time. The family I had been trying so hard to join had already assigned me a role. I was not the daughter-in-law they respected. I was not the wife Julian intended to protect. I was the system they planned to exploit until it became too expensive for me to leave. And the most frightening part was that some part of me already knew they had started. Standing on that balcony and hearing Clara describe me as something to be used should have changed my life. Looking back, that should have been the moment I walked away. The problem was that I didn't hear those words as a warning. I heard them as a challenge. Somewhere deep inside, the same fear that had followed me since childhood was still making decisions for me. I had spent most of my life believing that if I worked hard enough, loved deeply enough, and sacrificed long enough, eventually people would recognize my worth. The Sterling family understood that weakness better than I did. They never needed to force me to stay. They only needed to convince me that the next sacrifice would finally earn the acceptance I wanted. A few weeks after the conversation on the balcony, Julian came home carrying a notebook filled with diagrams, market reports, and financial projections. Unlike his parents, he knew exactly how to speak to my strengths. He didn't talk about family prestige or social status. He talked about solving difficult problems. He talked about building something meaningful. Then he introduced the idea that would eventually consume years of my life: Aegis Tech. According to Julian, banks and financial institutions were still relying on outdated systems that reacted to risk after damage had already been done. He believed artificial intelligence could predict instability before it became disaster. The technical challenge immediately caught my attention. For the first time, he wasn't describing another vague business scheme. He was describing a real engineering problem. Then he looked at me and said the sentence that convinced me. "Mac, One day, our children should be able to look at something and say their parents built it together. At 22, I heard love in those words. Years later, I would understand they were also a sales pitch. I said yes. That decision quietly reshaped every part of my future. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed fair. Julian handled investors, networking, and public relations. I handled the technology. He became the face of Aegis Tech. I became the person building it. What I failed to notice was how quickly partnership became dependence. Every major technical challenge landed on my desk. Every promise Julian made to investors somehow became my responsibility to fulfill. The deeper Aegis Tech grew, the more it relied on me. Eventually, I was working 16 to 18 hours a day. Some nights, I was still refining risk models at 2 in the morning. Entire weekends disappeared. Holidays disappeared. Vacations disappeared. Through it all, investors loved Julian. They saw a charismatic founder talking about innovation and growth. Meanwhile, I sat behind screens building the technology they were actually investing in. The heart of Aegis Tech was a predictive AI engine designed to identify financial risk before traditional systems could detect it. Every breakthrough inside that system came from thousands of hours of engineering work completed largely by me. Whenever the pressure became overwhelming, I reached for the same scratched stainless steel Yeti tumbler I had carried since MIT. My fingers tapped against the metal automatically. Dot, dot, dash, dot, dot, dash. The familiar Morse rhythm helped me think through problems and became a quiet ritual during some of the most exhausting years of my life. While Aegis Tech expanded, another pattern was developing. Money kept moving in only one direction, out of my accounts. At first, the expenses looked normal. Startup infrastructure, software licenses, legal fees. Then the boundaries disappeared. Arthur's financial shortfalls became temporary support. Clara's social obligations became business networking. Julian's personal spending somehow became company development. The mortgage gap on Arthur and Clara's Beacon Hill home turned into a recurring transfer of $2,800 every month. Julian's luxury vehicle insurance became a business necessity. Private club lunches became relationship-building expenses. Each explanation sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they told a different story. One evening, I opened the encrypted spreadsheet that had started with Arthur's unpaid $15,000 loan shortly after our wedding. Over the years, I had continued documenting everything: transfers, reimbursements that never arrived, family expenses, company expenses, outstanding balances. The engineer inside me trusted records more than emotions. So I kept collecting data, even when I wasn't ready to face what it meant. That night, I totaled everything. Then I checked the numbers again because I thought I had made a mistake. The final amount exceeded $350,000. More than $350,000 had left accounts connected directly to me. Startup costs, mortgage support, insurance payments, credit card balances, luxury spending. I stared at the screen for a long time. What shocked me wasn't the number itself, it was realizing how normal it had become. The Sterling family had slowly trained me to view extraordinary sacrifices as ordinary responsibilities. When I showed Julian part of the spreadsheet, he barely looked concerned. "This is what building something real costs," he said. "You know that better than anyone." Then he kissed my forehead and added, "When Aegis closes the next round, you'll see why it was worth it." I wanted to believe him. So I did. Then I became pregnant. For a brief period, I genuinely believed things were finally changing. Julian talked constantly about fatherhood. Arthur spoke about future generations. Even Clara seemed excited about becoming a grandmother. I allowed myself to imagine a different future. A successful company, a healthy child, a family finally united around something meaningful. Instead, the pressure intensified. Investor expectations increased. Product deadlines became more aggressive. Every success created another demand. Then my body started warning me that something was wrong. The exhaustion became impossible to ignore. My blood pressure rose. Dizziness became common. Some mornings I had to sit on the bathroom floor until the room stopped spinning. Eventually, the doctors delivered a warning that frightened me more than any technical problem I had ever faced. Stress had become dangerous for the pregnancy. If conditions continued worsening, both my health and my baby's health could be at risk. I remember sitting alone in the examination room, staring at the report. For the first time in years, Aegis Tech stopped feeling important. My child became the only thing that mattered. Julian was in New York meeting investors when complications became more serious, so I called Clara. I wasn't asking for money. I wasn't asking for favors. I simply needed help. Someone nearby. Someone I could depend on if things became worse. Clara listened quietly before explaining that she couldn't come because she was accompanying Julian during an important investor trip. The meetings were too valuable to miss. Mackenzie, this is not the moment to become dramatic, she said. If you want this child to inherit anything meaningful, let Julian do his job. Then the call ended. Hours later, I hired private nursing support. Because the situation was urgent, the agency charged nearly triple its normal rate. Every invoice came from my personal savings. Meanwhile, Sterling family credit cards continued generating charges from luxury restaurants, designer stores, and shopping trips. One afternoon, while a nurse monitored my blood pressure, I reviewed recent account activity and noticed purchases from expensive boutiques on Newbury Street. Clara was shopping while I was paying premium medical costs to protect her future grandchild. That realization changed something inside me. Not enough to leave. Not yet. But enough to stop believing every excuse. The final months of pregnancy became a race against time. Every day, I fought to protect my baby while finishing the core Aegis Tech AI engine. My body was exhausted. My savings were shrinking. My trust was beginning to crack. Yet I kept going because I believed there would be meaning at the end of the sacrifice. Eventually, after years of work, the algorithm reached full completion. The technology worked. Investors were excited. The company stood on the edge of explosive growth. Julian stood behind me when the final system test passed and whispered, "You did it, Mac. You saved us." I was too tired to notice he didn't say we did it. It should have been the happiest moment of my professional life. Instead, only days later, I was rushed into emergency surgery as doctors fought to save both me and my son. As I was wheeled toward the operating room, I believed every sacrifice had finally secured my family's future. What I didn't know was that, while I was preparing to risk my life, bringing our child into the world, Julian was preparing a different future altogether. Hidden inside a legal folder was a set of documents drafted before my surgery, waiting for a signature I was never meant to question, and a hospital bed that would leave me too weak to fight back. 3 days after nearly dying in childbirth, I discovered that my husband had stolen the company I spent years building. Even now, saying those words feels unreal. Not because they aren't true, but because of when it happened. While I was unconscious in an operating room, while doctors were trying to stop the bleeding, while my newborn son was fighting through his first fragile days of life. For years, I believed the greatest risk in my life was losing money. Then I woke up and realized the people closest to me had been preparing to take something far more valuable. During those first days in the hospital, my son became the only thing that mattered. Every conversation, every thought, every ounce of strength revolved around one question: was he going to be okay? Everything else faded into the background, at least until the third day. That morning, I finally felt strong enough to check my phone. I started clearing notifications and responding to messages when several security alerts from Aegis Tech caught my attention. Normally, I would have ignored them. Large-scale systems generate alerts every day. But these were different. Every alert had been triggered while I was unconscious. Years of working as a distributed systems engineer taught me one simple rule: when multiple unusual events happen at the same time, they are rarely unrelated. I opened the monitoring dashboard. The moment I saw the audit timeline, my stomach tightened. Administrative permissions had been elevated. Executive authority structures had been modified. Ownership records had changed. Legal access chains had been updated. I checked the timestamps. Then I checked them again because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Every change occurred while I was in surgery, while I was physically incapable of approving anything. At first, I tried to find an innocent explanation. Maybe attorneys were preparing documents ahead of funding. Maybe investors had requested temporary adjustments. Maybe there was a procedural reason I didn't understand yet. Then I opened the audit logs. That was when the truth became impossible to ignore. During the hours I spent unconscious, 90% of Aegis Tech's ownership had been transferred into Julian's control. Not proposed, not discussed, executed. My hands began shaking, not because I didn't understand the documents, because I understood them perfectly. Every authorization chain, every approval record, every dependency. Someone had planned this long before I entered that operating room. Then, I found the signature packet. My name appeared on pages I had never seen. My signature appeared beneath language transferring control of Aegis Tech to Julian Sterling. Arthur's initials appeared as a witness. Julian's digital approval appeared on another page. The timestamps sat directly inside the window when I was unconscious under anesthesia. For a long moment, I couldn't move. They had not simply taken advantage of my absence. They had used my medical crisis as cover. I stared at the screen and whispered into the silence. You forged my name while I was bleeding on an operating table. Hearing those words out loud made the betrayal real. Then, I found the email. Leadership Transition. The title sounded harmless. Corporate Routine. By the second paragraph, I realized I was reading a carefully crafted plan designed to erase me from my own company. Effective immediately, Mackenzie Vance would be removed from her position as Chief Technology Officer due to concerns regarding emotional instability and impaired executive judgment following childbirth complications. The wording was brilliant in a disturbing way. No direct accusations, no obvious discrimination, just enough language to create doubt. Just enough legal protection to justify removing me while I was too weak to defend myself. Emotional instability. That phrase stayed with me. They had taken the most dangerous medical event of my life and turned it into a weapon. What hurt most wasn't losing a title. It wasn't even the ownership transfer. It was realizing how long they must have been preparing for this moment. The surgery hadn't created the betrayal. It had simply created the opportunity. Suddenly everything made sense. Arthur's constant financial emergencies, Clara's manipulation, Julian's endless promises, the unpaid loans, the credit card charges, the sacrifices. Piece by piece, the entire picture came into focus. Aegis Tech became valuable because I built it. And once it became valuable enough, I became replaceable. The first thing I did was not call Julian. People who forge your name do not deserve advance warning. I exported the audit logs, downloaded the signature packet, saved the leadership email, copied every piece of metadata onto an encrypted drive linked to an account Julian didn't know existed. Then I sent a time-stamped backup to my attorney with a single subject line: preserve immediately. Only after that did I allow myself to breathe. Oddly enough, I still didn't cry. I think I had already cried enough over the previous 8 years. Instead, I felt something colder, clearer. The same feeling I used to get when diagnosing a critical system failure. The moment when confusion disappears and the root cause finally reveals itself. Because there was one problem Julian hadn't considered. He understood fundraising. Arthur understood money. Their lawyers understood contracts. None of them truly understood the infrastructure underneath Aegis Tech. The company wasn't a collection of legal documents. It was a system designed by someone whose entire career revolved around preparing for worst-case scenarios. Me. Years earlier, while building the platform, I had quietly implemented multiple defensive layers to protect it from unauthorized takeovers and ownership disputes. Most of them were invisible to everyone, except the original architect. Deep inside the authentication framework existed a renewal mechanism connected to a master identity profile. Mine. Every 30 days, a biometric verification process renewed a critical authorization token responsible for maintaining synchronization between protected systems. Without that renewal, permissions would gradually degrade, protected environments would stop synchronizing, critical services would begin restricting access. Eventually, essential portions of the platform would become inaccessible until proper verification occurred. It was never designed as revenge. It was insurance. I opened another dashboard and checked the renewal status. My pulse immediately accelerated. The protocol was still active. Nobody had removed it. Nobody had modified it. Nobody even seemed aware it existed. I checked the countdown. 23 days had passed since my last verification. 7 days remained. 7 days. I stared at the number. Then another memory surfaced. During the final weeks of my pregnancy, Julian had become obsessed with a major technology gala. Billionaire investors, venture capital firms, national media coverage, a $50 million fundraising round that was supposed to launch Aegis Tech into its next phase of growth. I opened the event calendar and checked the date. My heartbeat slowed. Then it slowed even more. The gala was scheduled exactly 7 days from now, the same day the authorization cycle would expire, the same day the system would begin protecting itself. For the first time since waking up in that hospital room, I wasn't thinking about what the Sterling family had taken from me. I was thinking about what they still didn't understand. Because there's a massive difference between owning paperwork and controlling infrastructure. Julian had successfully stolen the first one. In exactly 7 days, in front of investors, journalists, venture capital firms, and everyone he desperately wanted to impress, he was about to discover the value of the second 7 days. That was all the time remaining before the authentication cycle inside Aegis Tech expired. 7 days before Julian Sterling's highly anticipated tech gala. 7 days before $50 million in investor money was supposed to transform him into Boston's newest technology star. On paper, Julian had already won. He controlled 90% of the company. He controlled the board. He controlled the lawyers. Most importantly, he controlled the story. Meanwhile, I was recovering from emergency surgery, caring for a newborn son, and trying to rebuild my strength one painful day at a time. To anyone looking from the outside, the outcome seemed obvious. Julian Sterling was rising. Mackenzie Vance was falling. The truth was that Julian wasn't satisfied with taking my company. He wanted to erase my credibility so completely that nobody would believe me, even if I showed them proof. A few days after leaving the hospital, I drove to Aegis Tech headquarters. I wasn't expecting justice. I simply needed to see how much of my life still remained inside those walls. The moment I entered the lobby, I received my answer. The security guard recognized me immediately. I had personally interviewed him during the company's early growth phase. His expression changed before he even spoke. "I'm sorry, Miss Vance," he said quietly. "I can't let you enter the building." I nodded slowly. "Direct order from Julian?" He hesitated before looking away. "From the CEO's office." CEO. The title almost made me laugh. Through the glass walls, I watched engineers I had recruited and managers I had mentored move between conference rooms. Several recognized me instantly. None approached. Not because they hated me, because they were afraid. That realization hurt more than being denied entry. Fear had already done what Julian wanted. It had isolated me. The next morning, one of the engineers I trusted finally called. Human Resources had held an emergency meeting. Employees were instructed not to discuss company matters with me. Teams had been told that I was suffering severe postpartum mental health issues and might interfere with company operations. When he finished speaking, there was a long silence. Then he quietly said, "Mac, I don't believe it, but people are scared." That was when I understood the real strategy. Julian wasn't trying to beat me. He was trying to discredit me before I ever had the chance to defend myself. The emails started circulating quietly through investor groups, board members, attorneys, and business contacts. Every message followed the same pattern: concern, compassion, doubt. Mackenzie Vance was reportedly struggling with emotional instability following childbirth complications. Mackenzie Vance appeared unable to separate personal grievances from business decisions. Stakeholders were encouraged to approach any claims she made with caution. None of it was openly defamatory. That was what made it dangerous. They weren't accusing me of wrongdoing. They were planting uncertainty. Soon, people stopped asking whether my claims were true. They started wondering whether I could be trusted at all. Then I obtained a copy of the board presentation Julian had distributed. Inside were carefully selected medical records, edited timelines, and written concerns regarding my judgment following childbirth complications. Nothing was technically false. Everything was deliberately misleading. He omitted the forged signatures. He omitted the ownership transfer. He omitted the years I spent building the technology. What remained was a story in which a stressed new mother was attacking company leadership because she couldn't accept change. Reading it felt like watching someone steal my identity and replace it with a fictional character. Then came the voice message. I listened while holding my son in the dim light of the living room. Julian sounded calm, patient, and reasonable, exactly the way he always sounded when he wanted other people to doubt themselves. Mac, please stop doing this, he said softly. Nobody blames you for being emotional. Then he continued. You were always an incredible coder. That's your gift. Let the people who understand business handle the company. Stay home. Focus on our son. I'll make sure you're financially comfortable. Then came the sentence I replayed in my head for days. If you cooperate, I'll even arrange a monthly allowance. Allowance. After contributing more than $350,000. After building the core architecture of Aegis Tech. After nearly dying, Julian genuinely believed I should feel grateful for an allowance. That was the moment I stopped seeing him as my husband. From that point forward, I saw him only as an opponent. A few days later, another financial alert appeared on my phone. Luxury yacht reservation, private catering, premium champagne package, waterfront entertainment services, event production upgrades. Clara Sterling was organizing a celebration party, not for her grandson, not for the woman who nearly died giving birth to him, for Julian. Specifically, for Julian becoming chairman. That same morning, I had spent nearly an hour comparing prices for a specialized infant formula recommended by my son's pediatrician because every dollar mattered. Meanwhile, Clara was approving champagne packages that cost more than some families spend in a month. Before I froze the remaining card privileges, she approved even more upgrades. More guests, more liquor, more decorations. Thousands of dollars disappeared in minutes. I looked from those charges to the receipt for my son's formula sitting on the kitchen table. The contrast was impossible to ignore. One side of the family was celebrating a victory built on betrayal. The other consisted of a recovering mother calculating grocery budgets while caring for a newborn. For the first time, I stopped asking why they treated me this way. The answer no longer mattered. What mattered was finally seeing them clearly. That evening, after putting my son to sleep, I sat alone in the quiet house while rain tapped softly against the windows. My phone remained silent. No investors, no colleagues, no allies. If anyone had looked at my life in that moment, they would have seen exactly what Julian wanted the world to see. A defeated woman completely alone. Then headlights swept across the living room wall. I looked toward the window. A vehicle had stopped outside the house. Even through the rain, I recognized it immediately. The vintage Rolls-Royce. The same Rolls-Royce I mentioned at the beginning of this story. For several seconds, the engine remained running. Then the rear passenger door slowly opened, and the person stepping out was powerful enough to change the entire balance of the war Julian Sterling believed he had already won. For several long seconds after the Rolls-Royce stopped outside my house, I couldn't move. Rain slid slowly down the windows while the engine hummed quietly in the darkness. A week earlier, I had been lying in an ICU bed fighting complications from emergency surgery. Since then, my company had been stolen, my reputation had been destroyed, and nearly everyone I trusted had quietly stepped away. By that point, unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. Usually, they brought another problem, another warning, another reminder that Julian Sterling had taken almost everything. Then the rear passenger door opened. The first thing I noticed was a familiar silver cane. My heart immediately skipped a beat. A second later, a woman stepped into the porch light. Evelyn Vance, Grandma Evie. For a moment, I genuinely thought exhaustion was making me imagine things. Not because she wasn't real, but because she was the last person I expected to appear after everyone else had disappeared. I opened the front door before she reached the porch. Neither of us spoke at first. We didn't need to. She looked at me for several long seconds, taking in the exhaustion beneath my eyes, the weight I had lost, and the emotional damage I was trying so hard to hide. Then she wrapped her arms around me. That simple gesture almost broke me. During the previous several weeks, everyone seemed to want something from me. Lawyers wanted statements, investors wanted explanations. The board wanted silence. Julian wanted obedience. Evie wanted nothing. She simply held me until I stopped shaking. When she finally stepped back, she gently touched my cheek and asked, "Still standing?" I nodded. A faint smile appeared on her face. Good. That's all I was hoping for. Before sitting down, Evie asked a question nobody else had asked since the surgery. May I see him? For a moment, I didn't understand. Then I realized she meant my son. We quietly walked upstairs together. The nursery was dark, except for a small nightlight glowing beside the crib. My son slept peacefully, completely unaware of the war unfolding around him. Evie stood beside the crib for a long time without speaking. Then she gently touched his tiny hand. The expression on her face changed completely. The legendary Wall Street banker disappeared. The strategist disappeared. For a few seconds, she was simply a grandmother meeting the newest member of the family. He's beautiful, she whispered. Then she looked at me. And you almost died bringing him into this world, while those people were busy stealing from you. The warmth vanished from her voice. That part, Mac, I will never forgive. 20 minutes later, we sat together in my kitchen while my son slept upstairs. Rain tapped softly against the windows. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't feel empty. I made Earl Grey tea for both of us. As always, Evie stirred hers slowly. Clink. The spoon touched porcelain. Clink. The familiar sound immediately transported me back to childhood. Whenever Grandma Evie made that sound, somebody somewhere was about to regret a decision. I walked her through everything. The forged signatures, the ownership transfer, the board manipulation, the smear campaign, the voice message, the yacht celebration, the countdown hidden inside Aegis Tech. She listened without interruption. No dramatic reactions, no expressions of shock. When I finally finished, she placed the teacup onto the saucer with a sharp metallic clink and looked directly at me. Arthur and Clara really thought they could get away with this? I frowned. You don't sound surprised. That earned a short laugh. Mac, I stopped being surprised by those 30 years ago. Slowly, she began telling me things I had never heard before. Long before I met Julian, before Aegis Tech existed, before the Sterling family became fixtures in Boston social circles, Evie had already known Arthur and Clara. Publicly, they projected wealth, influence, and sophistication. Privately, they spent decades attaching themselves to successful people and leveraging relationships they had never truly earned. Arthur always wanted shortcuts, Evie said calmly. Clara always wanted status. Together they convinced themselves those things were the same as success. Then she looked directly at me. When Aegis Tech started growing, I became curious. I finally asked the question that had been bothering me since she arrived. If you knew what they were, why didn't you stop this years ago? Evie didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared into her tea for several seconds. Because adults are allowed to make their own mistakes. Then she looked at me. I warned you about them without directly saying it. More than once. She wasn't wrong. Looking back, I remembered dozens of conversations that suddenly carried a different meaning. Evie had never tried to control my choices. She respected me too much for that. I couldn't live your life for you, she said softly. But the moment they crossed the line from taking advantage of you to committing fraud against you, my patience ended. That was when she reached beside her chair and placed a thick leather portfolio onto the table. Inside were financial reports, audit summaries, transaction histories, property records, and private investigative findings. Some documents were recent. Others stretched back years. Hidden liabilities, unusual transfers, patterns of dependency. It wasn't random, it was systematic. My eyes widened as I flipped through the pages. You've been investigating them? Evie shook her head. No, I've been verifying them. She took another sip of tea. Investigation begins with suspicion. Verification begins after suspicion has already been earned. Suddenly, dozens of strange moments from previous years made sense. The constant requests for money, the financial emergencies, the entitlement, the expectation that everyone around them should absorb the consequences of their decisions. Then Evie opened a second folder and slid it toward me. This one contained a list of names: venture capital partners, angel investors, family office executives, technology fund managers. Every major investor expected to participate in Julian's $50 million fundraising gala. I scanned the list and looked up. How did you get this? For the first time that evening, Evie smiled. Because most of them used to work for me. The room suddenly felt smaller. One by one, she pointed at names. former analysts, former associates, former managing directors, people she had mentored, people whose careers she had helped build, people who still answered her calls. For years after retiring, Evie had intentionally stayed away from public life. She declined conference invitations, refused television interviews, turned down advisory boards. People assumed she was finished. What most of them didn't understand was that influence doesn't disappear when someone retires. Real influence compounds. The people she mentored became partners. The analysts became fund managers. The associates became CEOs. Even after nearly a decade away from the spotlight, a single phone call from Evelyn Vance still carried more weight than an entire public relations campaign. Julian believed he was preparing to impress investors. What he didn't realize was that many of the investors attending his gala trusted Grandma Evie long before they ever learned his name. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I felt something stronger than anger. Hope. Not because someone was coming to rescue me, because someone finally understood the battlefield. Evie's attention eventually shifted toward my laptop. The encrypted spreadsheet documenting more than $350,000 in expenses remained open. Beside it sat the countdown timer connected to the authentication protocol hidden inside Aegis Tech. She studied both screens carefully. The spreadsheet, the countdown, then the spreadsheet again. Finally, she leaned back in her chair and smiled. "You know what's remarkable?" she asked. I shook my head. She pointed at the spreadsheet. "You documented everything." Then she pointed at the countdown. "And you protected your work before anyone betrayed you." Her eyes met mine. "Most people show up with accusations. You showed up with evidence." For the first time in weeks, I smiled. Not because the fight was over, because I finally realized it was about to begin. For the first time since leaving the hospital, I no longer felt like a woman desperately trying to survive. That didn't mean the battle was won. Far from it. Julian still controlled the company. The board still believed him. The public story still favored him. But something fundamental had changed. I was no longer standing alone against an entire system. Across the table sat a woman who understood finance better than Arthur, strategy better than Julian, and reputation better than every consultant they could hire. Hope returned carefully, quietly, like the first light appearing before sunrise. Evie closed the portfolio, stood up, and picked up her coat. Then she looked directly at me with the same expression I remembered from childhood whenever she knew exactly how a situation would end. She glanced at the spreadsheet, then at the countdown timer, then back at me. A slow smile crossed her face. "They think they can swallow a Vance girl?" Her voice remained calm. That was what made it dangerous. They've forgotten who taught half the city how to count money. My pulse immediately accelerated. Evie walked toward the hallway, then stopped and looked back one final time. "Wear your most beautiful dress tomorrow night, Mac." I stood up. "Why?" Her smile widened slightly. "Because tomorrow night, we're going to the Sterling family's gala." The following day felt less like a fundraising event and more like a coronation. At least, that was how the Sterling family saw it. By sunrise, Julian Sterling was already receiving congratulatory messages from investors, board members, and business contacts eager to attend what many were calling the most important technology gala in Boston that year. Every new message reinforced the same belief. The battle was over. The future belonged to him. High above Beacon Hill, the Sterling penthouse buzzed with activity from morning until evening. Caterers confirmed menus, event coordinators finalized schedules, journalists requested interview slots. Luxury vehicles arrived and departed throughout the day. The atmosphere wasn't tense. It wasn't cautious. It was celebratory. That was the first mistake. Truly, dangerous people remain careful even when they appear to be winning. The Sterling family had stopped being careful. Arthur Sterling spent most of the morning reviewing guest lists and investor profiles. Every name seemed to improve his mood. Venture capital partners, technology fund managers, private equity executives, family office representatives. For decades, Arthur had spent his life trying to earn acceptance from circles more powerful than himself. Tonight, he believed he had finally succeeded. Clara was even more excited. She treated the gala as a social victory rather than a business event. Every floral arrangement, every seating chart, every photograph mattered to her. Despite the recent inconvenience involving the frozen accounts, she remained convinced the problem would soon disappear. In her mind, Mackenzie Vance no longer represented a threat. She represented unfinished cleanup. Julian, meanwhile, focused entirely on his presentation. He stood in front of a massive display screen reviewing slide after slide. Market projections, revenue forecasts, growth strategies, expansion opportunities. Every graph moved upward. Every chart suggested momentum. Every slide told investors exactly what they wanted to hear. Aegis Tech was growing. Aegis Tech was scalable. Aegis Tech was ready for massive investment. Julian knew the presentation perfectly. He had rehearsed it so many times he could almost deliver it from memory. What he never fully understood was the technology beneath those slides. He understood valuation. He understood perception. He understood fundraising. But the infrastructure powering the company had always been Mac's domain. Around midday, a small notification appeared in the corner of his laptop screen. Authentication renewal warning. Julian glanced at it for less than a second before dismissing it. A few minutes later, another appeared. Then, another. Similar alerts had surfaced throughout the week. Internal monitoring systems continued flagging upcoming authorization deadlines. Several engineers had submitted requests asking for review. Technical teams had suggested additional verification before the gala. None of those requests received serious attention. The event was too important. The fundraising round was too large. Every conversation eventually returned to investors. By now, the alerts had become background noise. At one point, Arthur noticed another notification briefly flashing across the screen. Everything all right? Julian clicked it away. Routine infrastructure maintenance. Arthur nodded immediately. That answer sounded reasonable enough. Neither man possessed the technical knowledge necessary to question it further. More importantly, neither man wanted to. Success has a way of encouraging selective attention. People stop looking for problems when the future appears guaranteed. Throughout the afternoon, the warnings continued, arriving quietly in the background. Orange indicators, escalation notices, automated reminders, one after another. Each one was dismissed, each one was postponed, each one became tomorrow's problem. Meanwhile, tomorrow was rapidly disappearing. As evening approached, the mood inside the penthouse shifted fully into celebration. Champagne replaced coffee. Music filled the rooms. Event photographs from the harbor began arriving on Clara's phone. Everything looked spectacular. The yacht, the ballroom, the lighting, the guest arrivals. Every image reinforced the same dangerous illusion. They had already won. At one point, Clara brought up the frozen financial accounts again. The issue still irritated her. I hope she's enjoying whatever satisfaction she got from freezing those cards. Julian laughed softly. If that's the strongest move she has left, we're fine. Arthur smiled into his drink. She's finished. The conversation gradually shifted toward the future. New properties, new investments, expansion opportunities, acquisitions, board appointments. Nobody discussed risk anymore. Nobody discussed uncertainty. Mackenzie Vance had been reduced to a footnote in her own story. Eventually, Arthur set down his glass and looked out toward the harbor. You know what the best part is? He asked. Julian looked up. Arthur smiled. A month from now, nobody will remember any of this. Clara nodded immediately. Most people already believe she's unstable. Arthur leaned back comfortably in his chair. Exactly. The story is already written. Then his expression hardened slightly. And if she keeps fighting, we'll deal with that too. Julian didn't respond. Arthur continued anyway. Once $50 million enters the company, nobody important will care what she says. He swirled the champagne slowly before adding the sentence that revealed exactly how far their arrogance had gone. Tomorrow, when that money closes, we should start discussing a long-term solution. Somewhere quiet, somewhere professional. Let doctors manage her. Clara immediately understood. Arthur took another sip from his glass. By this time next month, she won't be anywhere near that child or a single dollar connected to Aegis Tech. Nobody objected. Nobody challenged him. In that moment, The Sterling family no longer looked like people protecting a business. They looked like people protecting stolen property. Across Boston Harbor, the final preparations continued. Limousines arrived, one after another. Venture capital partners stepped onto the docks. Technology founders greeted investors. Security team managed guest arrivals. Journalists prepared cameras. The atmosphere felt electric. As sunset painted the harbor gold, the Sterling yacht cut smoothly across the water, carrying executives, investors, and distinguished guests toward the convention district. Standing on the upper deck, Julian looked exactly like the successful founder he had always imagined becoming. Cameras followed him. Investors shook his hand. Staff members rushed to accommodate him. Everywhere he turned, the world reinforced the same belief. He had already won. What Julian Sterling didn't realize was that victory had made him careless. Hidden beneath the polished speeches, expensive suits, flashing cameras, and smiling investors, a clock continued moving toward zero. By the time the yacht reached the convention center, 28 minutes remained. By the time more than 500 guests filled the ballroom, 25 minutes remained. By the time Julian stepped backstage to prepare for the presentation that would supposedly secure his future, 23 minutes remained. And for the first time all week, the warning notifications stopped appearing. The system was finished asking for attention. Now it was preparing to respond. Remove her. Clara Sterling's voice exploded through the ballroom speakers before I had even crossed half the room. More than 500 people turned toward me at once. Venture capital partners, technology founders, hedge fund executives, journalists, family office managers. For a brief moment, it felt as though the entire city of Boston had stopped to watch. On stage, Julian Sterling stood beneath a spotlight in front of a giant Aegis Tech logo. Only seconds earlier, he had been delivering the final section of the presentation that was supposed to secure $50 million in new funding. Lawyers were preparing documents. Investors were reviewing commitment terms. Everything had gone exactly according to plan. Then I walked through the door. Beside me, Evelyn Vance continued forward without hesitation. Her ebony cane tapped softly against the marble floor while whispers spread through the ballroom. Many people did not recognize me. A surprising number recognized her. That difference immediately changed the atmosphere. Arthur's smile vanished. Clara's face tightened. Julian managed to recover first, but even from across the room I could see uncertainty flicker behind his eyes. Clara stepped toward a microphone and pointed directly at me. Security. Escort her out immediately. Two security officers began moving through the crowd. Around us, conversations erupted. Some guests looked confused. Others looked uncomfortable. Several journalists immediately raised cameras. Julian seized the opportunity. He had spent weeks building a narrative around me, and now he intended to use it one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said smoothly, forcing a reassuring smile, "I apologize for the interruption. My wife has unfortunately been struggling with serious emotional difficulties since childbirth. We've all tried to support her during a challenging recovery period." The lie landed exactly the way he hoped. Not because everyone believed it, but because uncertainty is powerful. I could see people exchanging glances. Some looked sympathetic. Others appeared skeptical. Most simply didn't know enough to form an opinion. For weeks, that uncertainty had protected Julian. It had allowed him to control the story while painting me as unstable. One of the security officers stopped directly in front of me. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." I remained silent. So did Evie. The officer reached toward my arm. Crack. The sound echoed through the ballroom like a gunshot. Evelyn Vance's cane struck the marble floor with enough force to silence every conversation. The officer froze instantly. So did everyone else. Evie took a single step forward. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Authority radiated from her naturally. "Who among you," she asked calmly, "believes it is acceptable to put a hand on my granddaughter?" Silence swallowed the room. No one answered. Then recognition spread. A venture capital chairman near the front stood first. A hedge fund executive followed. Several investors exchanged startled looks. Within seconds, people who had been focused entirely on Julian were now focused entirely on Evelyn Vance. One investor quietly instructed security to step back. Another voiced agreement. The officers immediately retreated. The balance of power inside the room shifted. Arthur noticed it. Clara noticed it. Julian noticed it most of all. For the first time that evening, he no longer controlled the room. Sweat appeared along his forehead. Yet he still refused to surrender. He stepped forward and pointed toward the massive screen behind him. "Miss Vance," he said carefully, trying to redirect the audience. "With all due respect, you've only heard one side of the story." Then he pointed toward the Aegis Tech logo. "This company belongs to me. The platform belongs to me. The technology belongs to me." His voice grew stronger as he spoke, confidence mixed with desperation. "Everything these investors are funding was built under my leadership." The room remained silent. Nobody applauded. Nobody rushed to support him. 500 people simply watched. Julian continued because silence frightened him more than opposition. "Mac couldn't accept necessary business decisions. That's all this is." Then he pointed directly at me. "That AI platform is my property." For the first time that evening, I smiled. Not because I was angry, because I finally understood how little he actually knew. Julian believed ownership was a legal document. Engineers understand ownership differently. Ownership is knowing how something works when everyone else is guessing. Slowly, I reached into my bag and removed the same worn ThinkPad laptop that had traveled with me through years of 18-hour coding sessions, emergency deployments, infrastructure failures, and impossible deadlines. Several engineers in the audience immediately recognized what I was doing. Arthur stood from his chair. Clara took an involuntary step forward. Julian stopped talking. I walked calmly toward the conference center's internal network access terminal, located near the side of the ballroom. Every camera followed me. Every investor watched. The room had become completely silent. Somewhere inside Aegis Tech, hidden beneath layers of infrastructure that Julian never bothered to understand, the authentication countdown continued moving toward expiration. 20 minutes remained. I connected the ThinkPad to the network. The screen illuminated. Lines of monitoring data immediately appeared. I wasn't launching an attack. I wasn't hacking anything. I was authenticating myself into a system I had personally designed. That distinction mattered. Several technical investors seemed to realize it at the same moment. Their expressions changed. Julian looked toward the screen, then back toward the audience, suddenly aware that the conversation had moved into territory where slides and marketing language could no longer protect him. I entered a command, then another. System logs began appearing on the screen. Network authentication history, administrative access records, time-stamped authorization events, evidence, real evidence, not narratives, not public relations, not carefully rehearsed speeches, evidence. Arthur's face lost color. Clara's confidence vanished entirely. Julian stared at the display, trying to understand what he was seeing. The room remained silent. Nobody cared about his presentation anymore. Nobody cared about the projected valuation. Everybody cared about the truth. Somewhere deep inside Aegis Tech, the final countdown continued moving towards zero. 19 minutes remained, then 18, then 17. I rested my hands on the keyboard and looked directly at Julian. "You keep saying the platform belongs to you," I said calmly. "Good. Then let's see how well you know your own system." Then I pressed enter. Then I pressed enter. For a moment, absolutely nothing happened. The ballroom remained silent. 500 guests watched the giant LED wall behind Julian Sterling. Investors stood frozen beside tables covered in funding documents. Journalists waited. Lawyers watched. Even Julian appeared relieved. He smiled toward the audience as if the entire confrontation had already failed. "Is this really what we're doing?" he asked. "A theatrical stunt?" A few nervous laughs appeared throughout the room. I didn't answer. My attention remained fixed on the ThinkPad screen. Seconds later, the giant display behind Julian flickered once, then twice, then a third time. The final fundraising slide vanished. Every chart disappeared. Every revenue projection disappeared. Every promise disappeared. A deep crimson screen replaced them. The room immediately fell silent. Across the display, white text appeared one line at a time. Primary architect. Authentication required. System integrity protocol activated. Authorization token expired. Julian turned toward the screen. Arthur slowly rose from his chair. Clara looked toward the technical staff near the control station. Another line appeared. Primary system architect not detected. Searching for verified owner. The room watched. Nobody moved. Then a biometric authorization window appeared. Julian, visibly, relaxed. Finally, something he thought he understood. He stepped confidently toward the stage camera. There, he said. Problem solved. The system scanned his face. Processing. Verification. Then the result appeared. Access denied. Verified owner not found. Julian frowned. Run it again. A technician repeated the process. Access denied. Several technology investors exchanged glances. The atmosphere shifted slightly. Not panic. Curiosity. Then the system displayed another message. Searching historical authorization records. The screen filled with timestamps, login histories, security certificates, deployment approvals, infrastructure authorizations. Year after year of system history began appearing. Every critical architectural decision inside Aegis Tech pointed toward one name, Mackenzie Vance. Every major deployment pointed toward one name, Mackenzie Vance. Every infrastructure certificate pointed toward one name, Mackenzie Vance. A venture capital partner near the front slowly lowered his pen. Another investor closed the folder in front of him. Several technology founders leaned forward in their seats. They understood exactly what they were seeing. Metadata, audit history, ownership records. Information that could not realistically be fabricated in the middle of a live event. Julian felt the room changing around him. Those records don't prove ownership, he snapped. They prove she worked for the company. Nobody responded. The system wasn't finished. A final line appeared. Verified primary. Architect. Mackenzie Vance. Intellectual property conflict detected. Possible misappropriation of protected assets. The silence became heavier. Arthur's face visibly lost color. Clara gripped the edge of her chair. Then came the second stage of the protocol. Financial dependency records detected. Displaying supporting documentation. My encrypted spreadsheet appeared on the giant screen. At first, it looked like nothing more than accounting data. Rows, columns, dates, numbers. Then the system began organizing the information automatically. Mortgage payments for Arthur and Clara's residence. Insurance payments. Vehicle payments. Luxury expenses. Property taxes. Travel expenses. Credit card balances. Every payment originated from my personal accounts. Every transaction included dates and supporting documentation. The total continued climbing higher and higher. $50,000, 100,000, 200,000, 300,000. Finally, the numbers stopped. 350,000, $482.17. Audible gasps echoed through the ballroom. But the most damaging part was still coming. The supporting communications appeared next. Emails, text message, internal conversation. No commentary, no narration, only their own words. We can't watch the baby. We're leaving for the yacht party. Tell her to stop acting like a victim. She's becoming a burden. Another message appeared. Then another. Then another. Clara covered her mouth. Arthur looked toward the floor. Julian stared at the display without speaking. Across the ballroom, investors began reviewing the evidence instead of listening to explanations. That was the moment Julian truly lost the room. Not when the screen turned red. Not when access was denied. When the audience stopped listening to him and started listening to the data. One venture capital partner quietly closed his investment binder. A second did the same. Then a third. Lawyers began whispering urgently. Family office representatives stepped away from their tables. Nobody wanted to sign documents connected to a potential ownership dispute. One unsigned memorandum of understanding slipped from a table onto the floor. Then another. Within minutes, the funding round that had looked inevitable was collapsing under the weight of evidence. Under the bright stage lights, Arthur looked 20 years older. Clara appeared close to collapse. Julian stood motionless in front of a screen that now belonged entirely to the truth. Every camera remained pointed at him. Every journalist continued recording. Every investor continued watching. Then the ballroom doors opened. The sound echoed through the hall. Conversation stopped immediately. A group of dark-suited officials entered, carrying credentials and sealed folders. Unlike the investors, they weren't surprised by anything appearing on the screens. They looked prepared. At the front walked a senior investigator accompanied by representatives from the Federal Corporate Fraud Task Force. Behind them followed legal personnel carrying documentation. Grandma Evie never moved. She simply watched. Because she had spent months assembling the evidence that made this moment possible. The lead investigator looked directly toward the stage, then toward Julian Sterling. In his hand sat a federal subpoena package. As he began walking forward, it became painfully obvious that losing $50 million was only the beginning of the Sterling family's problems. Before I continue, I want to tell you something that no one in that ballroom understood on the night of the gala. When the federal investigators walked through those doors and headed toward the stage, it wasn't the beginning of the Sterling family's collapse. It was simply the moment the collapse became visible. The truth is that their downfall had started years earlier, the moment they began treating loyalty as something to exploit rather than something to earn. Once the subpoenas were issued, the investigation expanded quickly. Financial records were reviewed, asset transfers were examined, independent testimony was collected. The audit Evie had quietly assembled over months connected every missing piece. One document led to another. One answer created 10 new questions. The polished image the Sterling family had spent years constructing began falling apart under the weight of facts. Arthur Sterling lost the thing he valued most. Not money, reputation. His investment fund was eventually shut down after regulatory reviews uncovered serious irregularities. Business partners disappeared. Calls stopped being returned. People who once competed for his attention suddenly acted as though they barely knew him. The Beacon Hill mansion he used as a symbol of success was eventually seized when debts could no longer be hidden. Clara's punishment looked different. She had always cared more about status than wealth. The invitations stopped arriving. Charity events quietly removed her name. The social circles she spent years trying to enter simply moved on without her. The admiration she built her identity around vanished faster than she ever thought possible. Julian carried the longest consequences. Legal settlements helped him avoid prison, but they couldn't save him from years of financial damage. Lawsuits continued. Debt accumulated. Nearly a year after the gala, I happened to see him while leaving a board meeting. He was working inside a small computer repair shop, replacing components in an aging desktop computer beneath fluorescent lights. No stage, no investors, no audience. Just a man trying to rebuild a life he had spent years destroying. He looked up and saw me through the glass. For a brief moment, our eyes met. Then I kept walking. What surprised me most wasn't seeing him there. It was realizing I felt nothing. No anger, no satisfaction, no desire for revenge. Just distance. Healthy distance. That was the moment I understood I was finally free. Not when I reclaimed the company. Not when Julian was exposed. Not when investors abandoned him. But when he stopped occupying space inside my mind. Around that same time, Aegis Tech was reborn. Ownership was restored. Governance was rebuilt. Independent oversight became part of the company's foundation. But the biggest change wasn't found in legal documents. It was found in the culture. I moved the company into a campus surrounded by trees, natural light, and open workspaces. No executive monuments. No status games. No rooms designed to impress strangers. Just talented people solving meaningful problems together. For the first time since founding Aegis Tech, I enjoyed coming to work again. Yet the achievement I am proudest of has nothing to do with software. In honor of my mother, I established the Vance Scholarship Foundation to help single mothers pursue careers in STEM, engineering, data science, cybersecurity, mathematics. Every year, I meet women who remind me of the person I once was. Exhausted, overwhelmed, often underestimated, yet stronger than they realize. Watching them succeed healed something inside me that no courtroom victory ever could. One autumn afternoon, nearly a year after the gala, I sat outside with Grandma Evie. A cold brew rested beside me while my son practiced walking across the grass. Every few steps he stumbled. Every few steps he stood back up again. Evie watched him for a while before smiling. "That's a Vance," she said. I laughed. "Because he's stubborn?" She shook her head. "Because he refuses to stay down." We sat quietly as the wind moved through the trees. There were no lawyers calling, no investigations, no emergency meetings, no fear, just peace. The kind of peace I spent years searching for in places it never existed. Then Evie asked me one final question. "If they came back tomorrow and asked for another chance, what would you do?" I watched my son take another determined step forward before answering. "Maybe I'd forgive them." Evie nodded. I smiled. "But forgiveness doesn't mean reopening the door." She understood immediately, because that was the lesson hidden inside everything that happened. For years, I believed that love meant sacrifice. I believed that if I gave enough, people would value me. I believed that enduring mistreatment was proof of loyalty. I was wrong. Love is not a transaction built on exploitation. Loyalty does not require self-destruction. And healthy boundaries are not selfish. They are simply the line between compassion and surrender. Looking back, the greatest victory of my life was never exposing Julian. It was learning how to protect my peace without feeling guilty for it. So now I'd like to ask you a question. If you were in my position, would you have given the Sterling family another chance after they lost everything? Let me know in the comments below. And if you believe healthy boundaries matter, type the word boundaries in the comments. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Because sometimes the most important victory isn't defeating someone else, it's finally choosing yourself.